Well, it's good to see everybody. This is my first in-person live event to be up in front of a group since COVID. My last in-person live event in front of a group was in Melbourne 2 years ago. So I actually was here in Australia as COVID shut the country down, and I joke that I flew all the way here to have 2 cups of coffee and an event with 4 people. That was supposed to be 60, but it was right in that moment of closure. And then Qantas and Virgin Australia announced they were canceling 90% of their flights at 4 o'clock. 5 o'clock I bought a ticket, 6:30 I boarded a flight and flew home. It was the fastest closure and then drove way over the speed limit from Chicago back to my house to pull up to my home 10 minutes before giving the opening keynote for AEGN. Yesterday I was in Melbourne with you, and now I'm in Grand Rapids, but nice to see you all on Zoom instead. So this feels very much like a kind of coming back and picking up lost threads to be back here. And actually my first day of a month here in Australia, so it's nice to be with you all. Kay asked me to kick off today with telling you more about myself. I'm like, okay, well, make yourself comfortable. For the next hour, I'm going to tell you my life story. Not quite, but it was the question of how did I end up here? As Kay said, I've made my career here in philanthropy, and to tell a little bit about it, I thought what I would take this first session, how did I end up here, and then some of the reflections, having spent, now I've figured it's 27 years that I've been involved in philanthropy, and I'm only 32, so you can do the math. But you actually have to go back. I was born in Southern California, Newport Beach, California, into a family of wealth, lived in a gate-guarded community, and very idyllic, didn't know that we were wealthy because other people were wealthier than us. Grew up, mom was stay-at-home mom, dad was a commercial real estate developer. My great-grandfather had a manufacturing company that built Zambonis and street sweepers and industrial carts. The fun story of the family history is that we have not had it confirmed, but we've had a couple people say they think it is true, who are connected, that my great-grandfather was actually the inspiration or part of the story of Batman. Because Batman was based in Gotham, which was modeled on Newark, New Jersey, which was where his manufacturing facility was, and Wayne Manufacturing, Bruce Wayne. My great-grandfather's company was Wayne Manufacturing. You couldn't put a short Jewish man, though, into Batman, so they had to kind of change a few key details in creating the story. But we grew up, and then my mother was Catholic, and so that was actually one of the core kind of dynamics that has influenced the trajectory of my life, because my grandfather forced my father into bankruptcy, refusing to renegotiate terms, and we moved from Southern California to Portland, Oregon. Moved from a gate-guarded community. My mom went back to work. I went to work part-time at 14. But privilege is more than just money. And so bounced back far faster than most people would from something like that. But it was an awakening moment. To do that at 13 and 14 years old, right at the moment where I'd lost all friends, coming from private school into public school, from privilege to lack of privilege to, can we go do this? Sure. To, oh, we're going to need to do that next month because there wasn't money available. But I was just old enough to have agency over my own life, to go to work and help my family get back on their feet. And then I had something else happen. The conservatives in Oregon passed a ballot measure called Ballot Measure 47 that cut property taxes in the state of Oregon dramatically, which 6 months later, as they knew but pretended it would not happen, meant that cuts for public education and for public health were proposed. 25% budget cut to the public education system. And I was outraged as only a 14-year-old could be. I was on the student council, I got the flyer, I showed up, there were only 3 other students who came to this meeting, 12 parents. It should have been a packed auditorium, but this was the first announcement. So I got those 3 kids, classmates of mine, together. My mom was going to work, so she dropped me off early, which meant I showed up at the coffee shop early, which meant I wrote the agenda, which meant I became the executive director of Oregon Students Supporting Education. And we grew from 4 students to 10,000 students across the state, and along with unions and parents and other organizers, actually beat back most of the proposed cuts. So I was convinced at this really early age that organizing could change the world, because it had just changed mine. So off I went to DC, because that's where you go if you're going to change the world. You're based in the United States. Went to GW, worked in the Clinton administration in HIV/AIDS policy and presidential personnel, and got completely disillusioned with the dynamics of working inside the White House, particularly if you're 17 and have no power. Like, it is a disillusioning place to be. So everyone who gets disillusioned moves up to New York City. So I followed. My boyfriend really wanted to go to New York. Up I went, still doing organizing advocacy around LGBT equality, public education, and that was my career trajectory. I actually started doing my first grant making at 19. I worked for a group called the 21st Century School Fund. We got a grant from the Ford Foundation. I was the third staff person. We got $1 million grant from the Ford Foundation to re-grant to other small education organizing groups. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. This could be interesting. And then I get a phone call from my grandfather's secretary. It's the first phone call I ever got from Soli. I knew her. I would go see her when I visited in LA. She's like, is Poppy okay? She's like, no, he's fine. He just turned 80. I was like, yeah, I called him last week. I know. Well, he's decided to let the younger generations get involved in the Family Foundation. So I'm just calling to see if you're interested. Sure. What Family Foundation? It was the worst form of generational transition possible. To assign the secretary to call everyone to see if they want to join the Family Foundation. I didn't even know it existed. And actually my parents' generation and mine were invited at the same time to join the foundation. And as foundations go in the US, very small, $1.5 million in assets. My great-grandfather had set it up, like a lot of early family foundations set up in the 40s. They were actually set up as tax avoidance vehicles and to keep control of family companies. You would put the voting shares of your family company into a foundation, and that way they couldn't be taken over. Then 1969 comes around, the Tax Reform Act changed the regulatory policies for foundations, and foundations were no longer a good vehicle to maintain ownership of family companies, so that changed. We ended up with a small foundation. So here I am in New York, organizer, activist, starting to do a little grant making and a little family foundation, and this is just as the first conversations in the US were really picking up steam about next generation philanthropy. So I got connected with Resource Generation, which is probably the largest organization for young people involved with philanthropy, young people with inherited wealth. It was 3 years old at the time. The Council on Foundations, our equivalent to PA, just had was organizing their first next gen gathering. And my friend Rachel was involved, and she's like, oh, you should come. So I was at the first meeting and then went to the conference, and I'm sitting with the president of the Gates Foundation and the president of the Council on Foundations because I'm the only one under 50 in the entire conference. It didn't matter that multi-billion-dollar foundation, massive peak body president, young member of a foundation with $1.5 million. I got to give $5,000 a year. But that age gap was massive and mattered so much as they were trying to figure out how do we get other people like you involved. So I ended up getting more and more involved in philanthropy, spending more of my time in it until some friends we were having dinner, and they swear it was not planned, but it felt like a little bit of a professional intervention where all of them were like, you need to go spend your time in those philanthropy spaces to move money to the work we're doing, because you get to get inside of rooms that we can't get access to. And so I say that I moved from being a community organizer to a donor organizer. I went to NYU and got my Ph.D. looking at the role of philanthropy and policy change. So I became a certified philanthropy geek. Ran Boulder Giving, as Kay mentioned, which is an organization that collected stories to inspire people to give big and share more and take more risks with their philanthropy. And unbeknownst to us, the stories we collected reached the desk of Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett, and were one of the things that inspired them to launch the Giving Pledge. I loved it. It was amazing. Over the 5 years I ran Boulder Giving, I worked with hundreds of families all over the country and internationally, talking about how much is enough, how much can you give, how to take more risks, how to do more social change work, kind of push the edges. And when you're an executive director and you're 30 or 31 years old, you burn yourself out. And so, like many New Yorkers, followed suit, actually ended up in a hospital in Atlanta, collapsed from exhaustion after too much travel and too many speaking engagements and maybe too many cocktails, like 1 or 2 nights along the way. Until the emergency room doctor said, if you don't change something, the next time you're going to be in here with a heart attack. That was a shock. So I dropped off 8 of the 9 boards that I was on. Yeah, I was on 9 boards. Not really great. I was teaching 2 classes at NYU and finished those. Finished my Ph.D., still exhausted, and decided that I needed to leave New York. Cutting back was not enough. I needed a full reset. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine in Michigan. My life is actually defined by a series of unexpected phone calls. It's like, oh, now this is going to be the new chapter. He said, the Kellogg Foundation has just endowed this new professorship, the Kellogg Chair in Community Philanthropy. And I know you just got your PhD, but we're really looking for someone with field experience versus a long tenure in the academy. Might you have any interest? I was like, well, last week I just told my parents that I was ready to leave New York, so sure, let's talk. And they ended up recruiting me really hard. My dissertation advisor laughed. He's like, I've never had anybody go from dissertation defense to endowed chair in 6 months. There's normally like a 30-year career in between those 2 moments. But they offered me the role, and so I moved from New York City to Grand Rapids. And my first visit to Grand Rapids was for my final interview. And my second visit was to go house hunting. And I had no idea. I was like, maybe I'll stay for a year and catch my breath. Maybe it'll work out. And it was great. And actually, Grand Rapids reminds me a lot of Adelaide. It's about 1.2 million people in the metro area. It's a small city. We're halfway between Chicago and Detroit. So there's always the focus on the bigger cities, just like there's the focus on Melbourne or Sydney versus on Adelaide. We have a very active community. There's a lot of overlapping relationships. Even physically being here, you have better weather. But there's a lot of elements that remind me of Grand Rapids here in Adelaide. And it was great. So for 5 years, I was the Kellogg chair, and it's a kind of dream job to be an endowed chair. It's like, here's a paycheck, go do whatever research, writing, speaking, advising you want about how to advance your work. So my work was around community philanthropy, which isn't just place-based giving for me, but also how do we move money together? Donor networks, giving circles, funder collaboratives, pooled funds. And I came to Australia for the first time when Christian was doing his master's thesis, Director of Advocacy for PA, and he read my dissertation. So that makes him the 4th person to do so. And then he looked me up and he saw a couple of videos of my talks and emailed out of the blue like, would you have any interest in coming and speaking at the PA conference? I was like, sure, I've never been to Australia, sign me up, when do I leave? Came here, that was 7 years ago. And then I also did a workshop with Amanda Martin, who runs Australian Environmental Grantmakers. And 6 months later, she invited me to come out. And then Australian Communities Foundation invited me to come out. And then Reichstein invited me to come out and to work with them to launch Manifera. And I've been coming actually twice a year for the last 5 or 6 years until COVID put a little pause on that. But it's been amazing work. I've worked on launching a number of different donor networks and funder collaboratives. And I would still be in that role. So the final part of my story of how I end up in front of you, I would still be in that role except Trump got elected. And even though most of my personal work has been about social justice and social change work and volunteering and helping move money to social justice and racial justice, it just didn't feel like enough. And I couldn't stay in the academy while the world was burning. So I committed to academic heresy, and I left an endowed professorship to become a consultant, like the most secure to the least secure role you can do. And did that in 2019. By the end of 2019, work was taking off. So actually, Anna and Michael, my first 2 members of my team who joined me in February of 2020, right before I came here, and then right before COVID shut everything down. And then we just kept growing. So we're now 11. We're hiring another 2 people at Katisis. And we do donor organizing and advising. So we work with individual donors and families. We work with donor networks. We help set up and run pooled funds, all around advancing racial and social justice work. So that's my story. The part of what I thought I'd spend some time here of like, what does that look like? Make sure the time, great. Is what does that mean? What are the takeaways? For me, the three things I wanted to share about. One is like kind of, I realized looking back, it's been interesting since you gave me this prompt. I was like, what am I going to share for this opening session? That a huge part of what I have done for the last 25 years has been start things and scale things. Most of these organizations still exist. Some have merged into other organizations. The Multnomah Youth Commission I'm still proud of because I started that when I was 15. They just had their 25th anniversary, and the current board chair was interviewing me for a retrospective. We're talking about it, and she stopped. She's like, I was like, what? She's like, oh, I wasn't born when you did this. I was like, not ready for that announcement, but I think that one of the things we don't see enough in the US, and actually I find here in Australia so interesting, the philanthropic sector is still emergent. Even if you look at Melbourne or Sydney, it's still emergent. And I find when I've been here in Adelaide, people say, oh, well, we're just getting started. Melbourne and Sydney are developed. And I go to Melbourne and Sydney and they say, well, we're just getting started and we're behind. And I say over and over, because I've spent enough time here to do the compare and contrast, that you are just as far along as so many places in the US. I think it's really a difference of scale rather than of sophistication. And it's really important to separate those two. There is no surprise that there is more philanthropy and more variety and more experimentation in the US because there's more money and more people. We also have a much weaker government and have thrown things onto the backs of philanthropy that shouldn't be on the backs of philanthropy, and have innovated because of burden rather than because of opportunity. We have experimented because of gaps rather than in terms of expansion. So there's some really great things to learn from American philanthropy, but it's coming from a place often of scarcity and inequality, even more exacerbated than some of the same issues that we face here in Australia. But what I think and what I've seen over the last 6 or 7 years has been the kind of acceleration of opportunity here. New organizing, the Giving Circle movement, how it has exploded across the country. I've been doing research on giving circles around the world, and you see US and then Australia as really, I think, the second strongest place in the entire world for collective giving vehicles. There are a few more giving circles in Canada, but they actually tend to be just replication versus experimentation and pushing the edges. You see the types of conversations. I have friends working in some of the various peak and sub-peak bodies in the US who, when they come here for the first time, comment about how actually engaged people are in the peak and sub-peak bodies in philanthropy in Australia versus in the US. We actually have the dance of there's so much information and so much opportunity, people are zoning it out. And so you do have an opportunity, I think, to actually not see as like how to catch up, but how to actually push ahead. And sometimes it takes somebody from elsewhere to reflect back, so for what that's worth to share. I've also spent a lot of time traveling all over the globe working on how to move money, and it's been a piece for me of really trying to focus that it's not American exceptionalism, it's just, again, practice because of American inequality that gives the chance for repetition. And what you see internationally is I think there's a lot of tools to be taken from American philanthropy, but the context is really critical. To understand the back end, to understand the dynamics, and what doesn't export. The relationships, American philanthropy tends to be based on publication presentation rather than relationship, because the density of people doesn't allow for relationship-based organizing. It's on the flip side, why funder collaboratives have been so popular in the US is because people feel so isolated. And I was talking with somebody here who's been wanting to start a new funder group, saying it's really hard to get people to join. And they're like, well, we'll just co-fund. But if you're already in relationship, co-funding may actually give you enough. If you're isolated, you need more than that. So there's actually differences of dynamic. There's differences of culture. Working in Eastern Europe, where there's no tradition of philanthropy. So to talk about the dynamics of giving is actually culture change. I was at the Stockholm Philanthropy Symposium a few years ago, and someone said, we just wish our philanthropic sector was as strong as the US. And I said, well, I spend my entire time in the philanthropic sector trying to get our government to look like yours. You know, we're working from a different place and with a different set of intentions. And it's easy to forget the things that we have to value when we're comparing internationally. And it's been one of my critiques, frankly, of some friends and colleagues who I've seen come here, the kind of American exceptionalism that gets brought over. Oh, we can tell you what to do. It's like, well, we can also tell you what not to do, because we're very good at messing things up. And otherwise, you know, as we focus today on some of the questions of family philanthropy, on personal engagement and giving, on leadership in the nonprofit sectors, a handful of other things I wanted to mention that I talk about often. One is this concept of leveraging privilege. And it's been actually, I think, a defining feature of my life. So I had just enough access to get into these spaces. You know, I often say that there's a power to be able to organize people when you say we instead of you. We should do this. You know, do you want to join me in doing this? How about we put together this new initiative? And so being connected to a family foundation, even if all I get to give is $5,000 a year, which is my slice of our family foundation's giving, it meant that I was a foundation member. You know, the next generation of my family has now just taken over leadership. Two of my cousins are the new board members. And they're like, oh, well, we should get you involved. I was like, no, you got this. I'll support you. Because they're going to give $80,000 a year, and I have leveraged my privilege and my access. Last year, I helped move $45 million a year. All other people's money. But thinking about what you have to bring into the conversation, and it's so easy, and I've been hearing this in Australia the last few years, of like, as the sector has grown, as there's a number of new big foundations getting started or coming onto the scene, starting to hear the same echoes of one of the things I hear in the US, which is, well, we're not that big. Well, we're not that important. I mean, we're not this group, or we're not that fund, or we're not that trust. And like the immediate discounting of the work that we do because of this comparison. And I think if you flip it instead to say, well, what do you bring to the table? They may have dollars, but what are the other privileges? What are the other experiences? And that owning your experience kind of in tandem with the leveraging your privilege. Get into the rooms that you can to be able to move resources, and then owning all the experience that you bring into those spaces. You know, the US suffers from an over-professionalization of everything. But particularly in the philanthropy space. I got my Ph.D. in part because I wanted to be taken seriously. And when I first went for it, I said I actually had no interest in being a professor, and then go figure, I became a professor. But it was really about a credential. And I think it was both a thoughtful reason, and I'm glad I did it, and I would do it again. But I also think it's a critique of American philanthropy that would be a reason to go for an advanced degree, was just to be taken seriously. The level of expertise that comes from the groups on the ground is unparalleled. The intimate knowledge of issues that people in their own communities have, and frankly, the level of experience that each of us have, no matter the size of the grants that other people are talking about, is really, really critical. And I get asked sometimes, like, well, how have you moved where you are? It's like, I'm never been intimidated when I'm sitting and talking with a billionaire, because the size of the bank account doesn't actually address their expertise. And I think one of the best opportunities for advancing the field is if we didn't defer to the size of the bank account, but by the degree of expertise that each person sitting around a table had to bring. And figuring out how to hold that and remember that in conversations, I think, is really critical. I also, think that we need to spend more time, and we are woefully behind in the US, but also here and all over the world in the work around inclusion. Whether it's bringing in women or LGBT people, people of color, Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples into these spaces, privilege has made these spaces white and male. Privilege has made these spaces highly educated. Privilege has made these spaces so exclusive in so many ways, and we forget so many conversations. To me, part of my journey into this work was always being the youngest person in the room. Also, most of the time being the only queer person in the room. And the number of times very well-meaning trustees were like, well, what do the gays think? I was like, well, first of all, we don't say the gays. And there was, power and problem in that experience, right? There was power in the fact that I was in the room. So there was actually somebody who could say, well, we don't say the gays. I could talk about marriage equality, and when I came out, to me that meant I would never marry. The two were synonymous. I struggled with coming out because to me what it meant was that when I came out, that meant that I would never get married, I would never have kids, and one day I would die of AIDS. Those were three truths that I understood to be intricately connected to the experience of being a gay man in the United States. Thankfully, none of those are the case anymore. I am HIV negative. I am dating, not yet married. We'll see where that goes. But my boyfriend has 3 girls, so I might even end up with kids if everything goes well over the next few years. But being in spaces to bring those conversations up changed grant-making patterns. I have concrete experiences of where grant decisions were different because I was in the room. Being in conversations where they talked about how do we engage young people, and I would speak up and say, well, you should shift your meetings so that I don't have to keep skipping class to be here. And I actually rescheduled the Oregon Education Summit and told the governor in front of the press, so he couldn't really say no. I didn't even mean to be so provocative. I was just 15. It's like, well, can we move that because I've got a final then? And this was minutes after they were talking about how they were struggling to get more young people to come into these conversations and scheduling it during finals week. But no different if we think about what does it mean to bring people of color into a conversation? Are we ready for the places where they say that we've gotten it wrong? Are we ready to stumble? Have we built enough trust to be able to talk through the places where actually we have caused harm ourselves? If we are, it will change the way we do our grant making. And if we aren't, we need to get ready. And I talk about it here as intentional inclusivity, because the other piece of it is I think too often right now, especially in the US, the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion don't talk about the intentionality. Every board that I have chaired over the last 6 years now is a majority people of color board. None of them were when I joined. And part of my journey and part of my work has been to join boards, then raise my hand when they're looking for officers, end up in an officer role, and then try to get myself out of being there. And it's gotten to the point where people are like, well, how do you do it? I'm like, you literally just pay attention. We need to have a more diverse board, then we need to triple the number of people of color in the candidate pipeline. I'm not talking about preference, I'm just talking about recruitment effort. Where does it get posted? Who do we interview? Who do we reach out to? And when people say, well, I don't know anyone who would be a good candidate, to remember that's an indictment on us, not the fact that there's no candidates available. So the kind of flipping on every level, whether it's around gender, whether it's around race, whether it's around LGBT identity, whether it's around age, socioeconomic status, immigration status, educational experience, former incarceration, all of these identities that people bring into the room change the behavior. And I've spent basically my entire career in one way or other being just a little bit other, but just a little bit enough to be in the room. And that has allowed me to do a lot. But there's a certain dynamic of saying, well, do we actually have to always have just enough to be in the room? How do you actually open the rooms even more fully? Where you don't have to have just enough connection to be brought in, but to be able to be fully included. So we're actually getting to time. I've got more up here, but I want to pause and just see, got some time for questions, reflections. It's nice to get the chance. I was like, I'm going to spend the first hour talking about myself, but hopefully of interest before we dive into conversations around both the nonprofit leadership and around philanthropy the rest of the day.
I might kick it off.
Yeah.
One of the conversations that we have nationally is the word philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in the US, it's a common term. You talk about it at dinner parties. It would be sort of, you'd be proud to be a philanthropist, whereas here everyone's like, no, I give. And they shun the word philanthropy. So just some thoughts on how we could kind of embrace that word better here nationally.
One, it's actually that philanthropy is still a awkward term in the United States as well. It is embraced in certain privileged subgroups, but those who are working for economic justice often reject it because they have the image of Carnegie or Rockefeller as their association for it. And often I also hear the same, oh, I'm not a philanthropist, I don't give that much. I call it the problem of looking up. That people only think nobody thinks they're wealthy because they can point to somebody else who's wealthier. I was working with one donor. She told me in all seriousness, she grew up never thinking she was wealthy because her family didn't own a jet like her uncles did. And we laugh, right? I'm like, oh. And that was a true statement. Like her definition of wealth, the wealthy owned jets, they were just comfortable. In the United States, there was a pair of polls, years old now, but still really telling, that 80% of people, depending on how you framed it, 80% of the people thought they were in the middle class, or 80% of the people thought that the middle class had more than they did. So the bias of wanting to belong, and philanthropy is so often seen as something that only the wealthy do. And if you're in a space that's comfortable with peers, you can embrace it because then it's modeling good behavior as someone with wealth. Well, I give, that's a validating action. It justifies in a moral circumstance why I have these resources and what I do with them. But giving is far more comfortable. Everyone gives. The studies over and over show, not only in the US, but in most parts of the world, 80 to 90% of people are active givers. If you count, helping out your neighbor, if you count helping out at school, if you count donating food or helping in a crisis. But a far, far smaller slice of people identify as philanthropists or as donors. A lot of the work I did with Boulder Giving, we just would not use the word philanthropist. We talked about givers because it was just more effective. I'm like, I am more personally concerned about changing behavior than changing language. And I found that what I would do is use philanthropist as a phrase when I wanted somebody who was an active giver to shift to taking more care and thought and planning with their giving. So it's almost like, you've been a really generous donor. People who become thoughtful philanthropists also layer on these other thoughts. I wrestle with that. Sometimes I'm not even comfortable with my own use of that, of making this distinction between the two, but it's something I've tried.
But it's such a beautiful, the meaning behind philanthropy, the love of humanity.
Yep.
And you look at katasis, and maybe explain the history to the name.
Yeah, so katasis, she was the Byzantine goddess of generosity and the personification of the stable foundation to a building or a city. So one of the few large mural mosaics left of her is at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's right at the entrance to the ancient art galleries, and I used to live across Central Park from the Met, and so would often on the weekends go walk and then go in because I was single at the time and it was more fun to look at art than just to be single on a Sunday. And I just loved this mural, and so as I was starting katasis, I didn't want to use my own name. I wanted to have something that was more open and broad. I also did not want to be appropriative. There's been a dynamic in the US of using African terms or of using South American or Latino terms by people with no cultural connection and no heritage connection to those spaces and places. And Katisis is Byzantine, which covered up into southern Italy, which is actually where part of my family was from. So it's like, okay, for, if you go back many centuries, you might even have found one of my own ancestors there. And I pronounce it Katisis. I don't know if that's appropriate, but there are no Byzantines to ask. So that's how I pronounce the word. But yeah, it's been actually a touchstone for that kind of idea.
Anyone else? Question? I'll keep going with the questions. One of the things that often gets brought up in every meeting I have is everyone says to me, and you touched on it a bit, but our culture is not like the US.
Mm-hmm.
And we just don't have philanthropy. We just don't do philanthropy here. So what would the response be to people in Australia
Mm-hmm.
who are looking to move into the philanthropic space, and sort of the response that we should be giving, excuse me, when people bring that up? And it is common, they'll say, but and I think it's sort of that tall poppy syndrome, like you were
Yes.
saying. People are afraid to speak out and afraid to recognize themselves as generous or as
Mm-hmm.
giving. So it's much easier to kind of put it all in the US and say, oh, they're showy, and they just talk about themselves, and I say, yes, I'm dual citizen, and so I'm Australian too. But I think just a bit of encouragement and words of advice for people to kind of start having those conversations more freely.
Yep.
And the cultural differences that we're bridging.
There's a couple of things. One is I found as a persuasion tool, far better to talk about what you're trying to do than about who you are. So the resistance to being a donor or to being a philanthropist is present, but if I say, we need to build a new X, or we need to solve this problem in our community, would you join? Like, oh yeah, I'll help. And actually help means money as part, along with time and along with engagement. But when you ask people, will you, we're launching a new donor circle. Oh, well, I'm not a donor. We're launching we're putting together a group of people who are going to help create this new arts organization. They're like, oh, that'd be great. I would love to see that. So the flip is one piece, especially for those who are most reticent. Two, it's actually been why I think there's a real power in the giving circles and the community foundations in particular, that, and in groups like PA, like the American Jewish Funders, like AEGN, few people are comfortable being truly iconoclastic, of being the first, of stepping out and not following. Most people, regardless of wealth, regardless of success, like to be in a group. We're constantly, as human beings, kind of checking and seeing, like, am I by myself or are other people with me? And so the collective action is really powerful. To find peers, to find community, to join an Impact 100, to join a community, changes the behavior. Like, oh, I'm not doing this by myself. I'm actually doing something appreciated, that is appropriate, that is normalized. There's a norming experience to being part of these communities. And the friend and the relationship basis is really powerful. So figuring out how do you approach someone and who is going to be appropriate. One of the things in the US that we talk about that doesn't get talked about as much here is the conversations on philanthropy. Most of them tend to be performative or shallow. Because even though, and all over the world, people talk about how Americans talk about their philanthropy more. And yet in the US, one of the things you will talk to people is like, the only two things we don't talk about are money and sex. Now, there's plenty of TV about money and sex, but it's all surface level. It's all pretty shallow. What we really don't talk about is the complexity of either. We don't talk about our love lives, but even more, we don't talk about our money. I grew up hearing from my mother, this is family business. And talking with other donors and other people who have come from a family with wealth, versions of that are incredibly common. We're well off. We don't we don't rub it in other people's faces. We don't talk about wealth with other people. We don't bring these things up. And what it ends up sending is a set of signals about either shame or scarcity or concern or fear, lack of, hesitancy about being judged. that shut people down from any conversation. If I talk to you about my philanthropy and share too much, it gives you a window into everything else about me. And so I find we actually have to create spaces, and the way we bridge is often based on relationship or friendship. If I've gotten to know you enough to know that we share certain commonalities, there's then a safety to share. I'm trying to figure out like how much to leave my kids versus how much to give away. I'm trying to figure out if I should put my name and be a public donor, stay anonymous. I'm trying to figure out how to bring other people in. Like, I actually have to trust you enough to be comfortable that you won't think differently of me. And that's a big barrier even in the US. I think it's why, what we saw with Bolder Giving, what we see with the Giving Pledge, even in a country like the United States that is perhaps known more than any other as a philanthropic, country, because the flip side of the inequality that creates that, requirement and outlet is how powerful the storytelling of groups like the Giving Pledge or Bolder Giving, the modeling behavior from peers is. Like, we need those things as human beings. We're looking for those signs and signals. Yeah.
Jason, I just wondered when you were talking about that, that trust and relationship building, if you flip it and look from the not-for-profit perspective, because I know we've got a lot of NFPs in the room, how do they build that rapport and relationship to enable those conversations with people that might be potential donors?
Yeah. It's always complicated. So one of the things I regularly say, come to my next session, is the power dynamic always exists. I actually think one of the missteps right now in the US, too often we're like, how do you reduce the power dynamic? How do we equalize the power relationship? I actually think it's the wrong metaphor. Reduce or equalize versus how do we name and navigate the power dynamic? Because one says, I actually need to change the power relationship, but if you're a multimillionaire and I'm not going to change your financial behavior unless you give me all your money. Jason Franklin Travel Fund is open for donations. But I can't change that power dynamic. But if I name it and navigate it, then we can actually build a relationship. We talk about needing to value people as not just walking checkbooks, but as full people. But actually, full people includes the fact that I'm building a relationship with you as an executive director of an organization with you because you are a potential donor. It's the same in work around racial justice. There's a conversation that colorblind is actually a privilege of white people. Only those who are white in the United States can say I'm colorblind because we are privileged by the color of our skin. My friends who are black or Latino or indigenous can never be colorblind because the color of their skin defines how they walk through the world. In the same way, if I'm a donor and you just want to build a relationship with me as if I am not wealthy, you have actually tried to fake and ignore one of the things that defines the relationship that we are building. So you actually have to name and then build a true relationship that includes acknowledging wealth, includes acknowledging financial capacity, but isn't only about that. Because and this is a difference between a foundation staff person and a donor. As a foundation staff person, it is your professional identity to steward and move resources. But then you go home afterwards and you're just yourself. And if you quit your job and go somewhere else, you no longer have access to that money. Whereas if you are an individual donor, unless you go bankrupt, that money is part of your life. It is a defining feature of how you show up in the world, how you move through the world. And so we actually need to see the complexity of that wealth as part of who you are. My great-grandfather was incredibly proud of the company that he built. He wouldn't have spent 50 years of his life building that company if it did not have any meaning or purpose. And so trying to get to know him and not mention money. And then my grandfather who took over, same thing. You actually have to mention money because it was the driving force of his life, which was very frustrating at times, let me tell you. But that's who he was. That was a big part of him. And then the other piece, so I can riff for as long as you want me to keep going, but the other piece I'd bring up is, again, friendships. So if you're running an organization and you're trying to build those relationships, start with who already is connected to you. And how do they bring people in? Whom of your friends, who do you invest with? Who do you know? Who are you in business with who might also be interested? But again, not asking them to pretend that I'm very frustrated these days with, I think, this attempt like, oh, it's just a friend-raiser, it's not a fundraiser. Every fundraiser is a fundraiser, we're just delaying the ask. And actually, when we do that, people instinctively, we know that it's not authentic, it's not true. And so our guard is up. You're like, I really would just love, I just want you to learn about the organization. I'm like, I know why you want me to learn about the organization. I think we do ourselves a disservice and we slow things down when we try to pretend that's not the reason we're building relationships. Now, on the flip side, rather than a friend-raiser, if you're actually looking for advice, great. The saying, of course, you probably heard it, is, if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. But if you want nothing, ask for advice you don't really want. Because I can tell. The number of times people reach out, like, oh, we're trying to bring together a group who will help us develop a new communication strategy. I'm like, so why are you calling me? Now, if you want to call me and ask for advice around donor engagement, or if you want advice around philanthropy, I have things that are my areas of expertise. So the other piece relating to the friendships is to think about not just the generic fundraiser, but the advice. Like, hey, we want to bring in new donors. Also, our CRM and our digital systems are really not good. Can we find 3 people who could come help give us real advice on how to improve our CRM or our data systems, who might actually have real concrete advice that would help us do it, who might also then get engaged with the organization and become donors? Because if you go to a database engineer or somebody who runs a cybersecurity firm and ask them for real advice, they're like, oh, I know what to tell you. I can help you with this. You can build a relationship that's authentic based on skill, versus we just want your help with messaging, or we want your insights about what. My other least favorite is like, we're trying to talk to the community to find out what they need. But actually the community you're serving is not the community that I'm really part of. And this happens a lot with housing and food assistance and programs that are designed to serve those who have few financial resources. And then you say, oh, we need community input, and you go ask wealthy people to give community input for services designed not for them. It's inauthentic. You're actually trying to get money. So. Yes.
Question. A lot of your conversations has been around the sort of the one-on-ones and influencing people. And culture is an area that's always interested me, and it seems to me that there's not a lot of investment in changing culture through leadership. If we look in the Australian scene, we've got the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Institute of Directors, Philanthropy Australia. The Business Council of Australia, what are they doing about changing the culture of corporate social responsibility? Philanthropy Australia, we look after the high end of the market. What are we doing about educating the accountants? The conversation they have with their ultra high net worth clients. It's a hard one. It's the long-term approach to changing culture. What's happened in America around educating and influencing cultural change so we can scale philanthropy rather than tackle it on a basis?
It's a great question. Part of the challenge is that you don't have cultural change is hard to fund. Because if I tell you, I said, I'm going to launch, I ran Boulder Giving for 5 years. Our entire purpose was changing the culture of philanthropy, inspiring people to give big and take more risks with their philanthropy. So what we did was cultural work. We were storytellers. We collected and shared stories of individual people who were giving more, who were taking risks. We did a lot of media work. Over the course of 5 years, we placed like 200 plus articles in the press. Most of them never had our names on them. We were calling people and say, hey, Town and Country magazine, you're looking to talk about, home decorating and philanthropy. We've got a story, we've got a person. We place business people and how they integrated giving in their business into business magazines. And we would do all the behind the scenes kind of prep with the speakers, helping tee up articles. The challenge of it is it's really hard to measure the impact. That citation that Melinda Gates gave us on the when they launched the Giving Pledge was the most powerful thing for my fundraising and running Boulder Giving for years, because someone with credibility said that our work inspired her. I'm like, oh, evidence of impact, because otherwise it's really hard. We were a small organization. The national average of how much people gave did not significantly change. I had output metrics, news articles, conversations, but impact metrics are very hard on cultural change. And I think that it's some of the most powerful work. It's actually, I think, some of the most high leverage work we can do, but we have to be prepared to do it without seeing evidence. We've seen things in the US like the American College of Financial Services has developed the CAP program, the Chartered Advisors in Philanthropy program, which is a professional certification that accountants and estate planners, community foundation advisors are going to get. And it's actually teaching you, like, not just estate planning, or it actually was designed by someone who used to be in insurance. Here's the insurance vehicles, and here's the charitable insurance vehicles, a charitable remainder trust or an charitable annuity trust. But now there's hundreds of people who have the CAP. And so you actually go to financial services conferences, and there'll be a session on their agenda that actually a philanthropy organization didn't set up. It was people embedded inside a financial services firm who want to talk to other people embedded inside financial services firms about how are you integrating charitable insurance instruments into your offerings. That's cultural change. The minute where it's not the proactive philanthropy group doing it, but the finance people to the finance people doing it, you've changed who's having the conversation. So like but that took years, and it's very indirect to see those benefits. I think the other piece of cultural change, which is so compelling and challenging, is pop culture. How do we lift up? There's been some really good work in the democracy space in the US by Kerry Washington and a number of other really A-list celebrities who are trying to engage other celebrities to step up and support democracy work. All behind the scenes, all very quiet. And I've been talking with a few of them about how to do a parallel piece around philanthropy. And because the problem, pop culture is culture setting, norm setting, but most high-profile foundations by actors or actresses or athletes or rappers or musicians tend to be sponsorship-based. I'll put my name on it and then ask other people to give their money in, and I'll give their money away to look better. Versus actually norming of, Kerry Washington has created her own fund that she funds. Rihanna has created her own foundation that she's putting her own money behind. And those become touchstone moments for people, but much more than the random business owner who is not seen in pop culture. If you hear about Rihanna and her philanthropy, it ripples differently. And so how you then do that and then provide the support. So I've been doing work with agents and celebrity managers, and how do you talk to them to provide the back end work for that. I think there's a lot of this opportunity to kind of fund the infrastructure and to organize the infrastructure. You just have to be prepared for the ripple effects of it to be seen in 2040.
Similar question to that. It seems in the US that there's more of a culture of giving to advocacy, and that's sometimes equally hard to measure impact, but at least if you get a policy change, or you can see the structural impact in some way. Australia, I think the Manifero thing that you're coming to speak at is a great step forward, and the Snow Foundation giving to marriage equality was awesome, but there's not that same culture of giving to advocacy. People want to give and go, how many people did you feed, or how many sessions did they have with a counsellor, or whatever. How do we address that and make people see that, help people to see that if you change the laws and change the systems, then you actually get more change in the long run than the whole ambition at the bottom of the cliff versus.
Yeah. I've talked a lot with Tom Snow and the Snow Foundation about this. I was very involved in marriage equality in the U.S., so that I chaired the Proteus Fund, which housed the Civil Marriage Collaborative, which was the largest collaborative fund for marriage equality work in the United States. And there's two parts to the advocacy. One is rights, and one is systems change. Not systems change, systems delivery. And I think they're important to differentiate, because marriage equality, the only way you can achieve it is through advocacy work. There's no service option instead. Versus public education or food security, there's actually both options are available. I could fund 10 meals, or I could fund advocacy that would change a governmental program about how people would be fed. So first is to actually separate anything that's racial justice or civil rights is by default advocacy oriented, because there's no other way to preserve it and there's no other way to protect it. It's helpful, I think, sometimes to name that for people, because they're right. If I care about certain civil rights issues, I must do advocacy work. And on that front, I actually think, one, how do we get people to do it? Is we do it ourselves. We de-risk it and we create models. Tom and Georgie both talk about how they get calls all the time at the Snow Foundation from other funders wanting to know, well, how did you do this? What was the dynamic of it? How did it play out on completely unrelated issues, but because they were so public as funders for marriage equality? The more people and the more examples we have that are public, the more it will happen. So for you to step up, or to get the foundations that you run to step up, to fund the immigration reform work, to fund the healthcare reform work, to fund the others, and to be public about it. It's actually, sometimes we want to be quiet because we don't want to make the work about us, but we actually limit our impact if we don't talk about our work. I talk with donors about whether anonymity is in service to the work or in service to you. Are you choosing to be anonymous because you don't want to make a big splash, or are you choosing to be anonymous because you don't want to distract from the work? The other piece that I find is to, on the service side especially, is overcoming what I call the problem of big numbers. We have a very difficult time as human beings with big numbers. How much bigger is 10 million versus 5 million? To expand our program by 30%, we're like, to reach half of Australians, these numbers are too big. And so we don't actually get the difference in a visceral level of providing another 1,000 meals versus investing in money that will feed 50,000 people. So one is, I actually find visualizations, or we don't invest enough in the communication and visualization that helps people understand the difference. The ways to visualize, the big numbers can actually change people's behavior when they can see, you pour the water in, this is how much water pours out. So different types of visualizations can help break past that resistance. And then the other is storytelling. Is the examples of what happened from the past, success stories. There was a great book, actually, there's a great appendix book that was written in the US. I'll find and have for you but it was a case of 100 examples of philanthropy in the United States and policy change. Each one was about 2 pages long. And it was the one I always remember was the white lines on the sides of the road. So that was actually an innovation of philanthropy. When people first started driving, there were no lines on the roads. There were lots of accidents. Somebody figured out that if you painted lines on the roads, everyone stayed in their lane and didn't crash into each other. And then a foundation underwrote a pilot to paint lines on roads and measure how many accidents happened. And then the pilot proved to be incredibly effective, but nobody wanted to do it. And so there was 2 options: go paint lines everywhere, or advocate to the government to go paint lines everywhere. And they figured out that, well, we can afford to paint lines on this many streets, or we can spend the same amount of money to get lines painted on every street. And those type of stories and examples help people make that connection of oh, this is why I'll invest in advocacy versus just pay for it myself. The dollars are so very different. Yeah.
That publication would be great to get hold of if you have a...
Oh yeah, it's, I can tell you in 1 second, because...
I'll make sure I'll send a link around. Now, we might just break for morning tea shortly, but Jason,
Yeah.
you've had such an incredible career, and you're already, you're still young. What's been one of the best highlights, and what was a key lesson learned?
Well, first, it's called The Casebook for The Foundation by Joel Fleischman. So the book was The Foundation, and then he has a casebook for the foundation.
Yep. Thank you.
And it's actually the full casebook is available online from Duke University. So he's a professor at Duke, and they put the whole appendix all online. So all of those cases are downloadable. Highlight. Personal. I worked with all sorts of celebrities, all sorts of. I don't get starstruck very much, but a personal highlight was spending time with Jane Goodall. So at the Stockholm Philanthropy Symposium, and there were 3 keynote speakers. The morning keynote was Melinda Gates and Princess Margaret of Norway. The evening keynote was Jane Goodall, and I was the lunch keynote. I'm like, one of these things is not like the other. How did this sandwich end up happening? And Melinda Gates and Princess Margaret, great. Jane Goodall, I was starstruck. Someone I had just grown up watching, and the piece that made it so powerful, we ended up just chatting, and it turns out that one of the funders who first supported her work, John Stryker, who's also from Southwest Michigan, who I'd actually just had dinner with a few months before that. And so we're like trading stories about John and about the impact that his funding had on her when she was just getting started. And it was kind of an interesting reminder of like how big icons are also still just people. And there was a moment that she was just getting going, and somebody, John had given her one of her first grants. And he, who has become like one of the biggest, his 2 things in philanthropy are LGBT equality and the preservation of great apes, because he had a pet monkey when he was a kid. And like the personal dynamic of philanthropy, his father also happened to be the founder of Stryker Medical Corporation, and he's a billionaire donor. But how personal, regardless of the scale, and how someone like Jane Goodall also was just getting started at one point, and someone gave her, a small grant to keep going. So.
And key lesson learned? When something went really wrong.
When something went really wrong. Yeah, I cannot do it all. I'm still learning that lesson.
I think you were telling me the story about when you walked into a grant room and your ex-boyfriend was sitting across the table.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, it's actually, and I'll talk about it a little more this afternoon too, of we forget, and even now, as often as I get reminded, we forget how much relationships matter in all of this work. That the best programs, the best pitches, the best spokespeople, it's also about all the relationships. And yeah, I walked into a grant meeting, and my ex-boyfriend, we'd only did it a few months, but it had ended dramatically bad. I did not realize he was on the grant panel. And I walked in and it was just like, not getting this grant. I did not get that grant, and it did not work. And yeah, as a result, I take a lot of care with the relationships I have. I always find, I count it a big compliment when someone says they appreciate how easy it was to reach me. That no conversation, I'm not too important for any conversation. It's not about how much money you have or what type of role you hold or who you're representing, because the relationships are varied and overlapping. And this work is all about relationships.